Hi, everybody. Welcome to the November 6, 2015 edition of Colorado Inside Out. I'm your host, Dominic Dezzutti. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's get a quick take on Republican State Senator Tim Neville announcing that he will challenge Michael Bennett in the race for the U.S. Senate. Patty Cahoon from Westward. Now, Tim Neville, I'm sure, is a fine lawmaker and will be a fine candidate, but you know that we're a little desperate right now for candidates if that's making the big headlines right now, that he's the big Republican running for Senate at this point. What do you make of the announcement?
Well, I think it's because the light rail driver outside this studio refused to do it. Now, we've had so many people say they thought about it, they dismissed it, and Neville has been flirting with the idea for a long time and just kind of waiting to be picked, and now at this point, he just got to pick himself because no one else is in.
Amy Oliver Cook, Executive Vice President over the Impens Institute. Thank you very much for joining us. What do you think of Tim Neville's chances of getting some more support, even though maybe not a top-tier candidate right now, but could he become one?
Interesting question, but I think that the Bennett campaign is actually going to be looking forward to having a real name. I got a fundraising email from them saying that he's running against Colorado's own Donald Trump, a guy named Robert Blaha. So Tim Neville at least has a little more name recognition. And yeah, there'll be some support. I wouldn't underestimate Tim Neville. He is very smart. But on the other side, he's also attached to some of the more farther right elements of the Republican Party, not really the Cory Gardner type of candidate.
Sure. Penfield Tate joins us, attorney with QTAC Rock. Thank you, and a former state lawmaker. So thank you for being here. Tim Neville, within probably some policy wonks and folks like us that get into politics, know a little bit about his background, things like that. What about the middle part of Colorado that really decides elections statewide? I mean, when they hear Tim Neville, they confuse he might be one of the Neville brothers. Or do you think that he's actually a viable Senate candidate?
Well, that might probably hold him in better stead than his policy. I sort of smiled when Amy said he's kind of attached to some of the more conservative factions and points of view. No. Tim is just that. One thing, he's going to be direct, he's going to be outspoken, he's going to be clear. And the vast majority of Coloradans are going to disagree with him on almost every substantive issue. And so, Patty's right. No one else will step up and run. I think Michael Bennett is probably vulnerable, more vulnerable than he's been in his tenure. But, the GOP bench in this state is just depleted would be an understatement. You've got Tim, who's, I think, stepping up because he may think it's going to be neat. Robert Blaha is, well, I won't even go there. But anyway, it's unfortunate. I think Tim's going to get hammered unless something very bizarre happens, like Donald Trump becomes the presidential nominee. Then it'd be a Donnybrook.
Kara DeGette, editor of the Greater Park Hill News, rounds off the panel for us. Do you think that this is going to be as big of a name that we get from the Republican side, or is there enough time for another name to get in the race? I mean, we're talking... I realize we're still a year away from Election Day, but when we're running a multi-million-dollar statewide campaign, you really can't sit on the sidelines for too much longer if you think you're going to pull off going up against an incumbent. It's not just any race. Is there enough time for somebody else to come off the sidelines?
Well, that's a really good question. I would imagine no at this point. We do have, I think, a couple more months before, that, line is drawn, as it were. But yes, Penn is right. There's just a very small and depleted bench in Colorado at this point. The
Caldera folding chair.
Well, Caldera, Caldera could step up. I have heard, Ryan Frazier and Tim Neville, if this is the best they can do, then that's, unfortunate for the Republicans. It's interesting, though, because I keep getting these fundraising pleas from the Bennett campaign, saying, this is, the most competitive, this is going to be the most competitive race in the country, and please help, step up now, and, we might be in trouble. And I keep thinking, where's the candidate?
Exactly. It's probably the hardest person that's hitting is the fundraising efforts for Michael Bennett saying that there's actual emergency. I get what you're saying. The recall effort that attracted national headlines in Jefferson County was successful this week as voters removed the 3-member conservative majority. Voters in Douglas County did not re-elect 3 conservative members, joining other counties in a major turning back on education reformers in Colorado. Patty, I think we knew where the tide was turning in JeffCO. It was going to be an uphill climb for that recall effort to not be successful. But I'm not sure if we really anticipated the wave, especially in Douglas County, where it didn't even look as big of a campaign as it did 2 years ago. What were your thoughts on the results from election night?
Well, certainly a year ago, we wouldn't have thought that education, and not necessarily education, but education entities were going to be the big issue in this election. That was just when the protests were starting over the new board and the history hullabaloo. The fascinating thing about JeffCO, which really was the most watched race in the country, unlike, say, Bennett versus Neville versus Blaha, that it was incredible how quickly the tides turned, much more than anyone anticipated, and it wasn't really because of the substance of what this board had or hadn't done. It was how the board had behaved. And that's the lesson that I think everyone needs to follow in Colorado if we want to put an end to the recall. It is behave like a grown-up once you're elected. You know, don't diss kids, students, if you're trying to teach a lesson to them. Don't diss their parents. Behave yourself. And that was really the story in JeffCO. The amazing thing in Douglas County, I hadn't heard about the board misbehaving. That maybe emphasized much more the sentiments out there, which is some of these reform fixes in education are not working, and we're going to throw everyone out again. So incredible stories in Colorado. And then in Denver, the Happy Haynes almost losing the school board. I think that was another one that had much less to do with education than people are tired of the old school the old guard coming back in, and in Happy's case, she also now is head of parks, and I think that was too much for a lot of Denverites. She barely squeaked in.
Mm-hmm. Amy, the Independence Institute was a major player in this, supporting a lot of the reform efforts. So a tough night over at the Institute, but how do you look at it now that we're a few days away from election night?
Well, if I gauged my emotions on every election, it'd be like, gauging emotions on day trading. So we look at a long-term approach, and yes, reformers across the state lost. But let's look at the people who in Jefferson County who won. They won by embracing the policies of the prior reform board. So they won by saying, yeah, we agree with equal funding for charter schools. Are they going to now turn back that equal funding? How about raises, $21 million in raises for teachers? Or are they going to go back and say, listen, we're now going to build a school without any debt? So in the election, they actually embraced reform ideas. Now, if you were to go back to it, and this is where we take a long-term approach, 22 years ago was the Charter School Act, or almost 23 actually. If you had thought, and that was just right at that time, we're going to do something groundbreaking. 23 years later, charter schools would be the largest district in the state if it were its own district. The reform train has left the station. I don't think you're going to roll those back. Personalities will change, but people like the reform policies. To Patty's point, they don't like being disrespected. They just like the reform policies. And I think you're going to find that going forward. We may have a swing in elections, but I don't think you're going to roll back those reforms because people like them too much.
Mm-hmm. Pat, I think I agree with much of the sentence that's been said already, but I would add to it, not only do folks not be disrespected, but I think politically, it's when you play your hand too broadly, you played it too hard, and it's going to swing back. We've seen it politically in the legislature quite a bit, but I guess this was the first time we saw it on such a grand scale with school boards. Do you see, what's your take?
Several lessons here, and this is a topic we could devote a whole show to this, but I agree with what's been said, and I've said it before, particularly about the folks in JeffCO. Sometimes how you treat people is more important than what you do. And I think they started very early on, and at least they were consistently bad. They treated people poorly, they were disrespectful, they talked over people, and they didn't seem It's one thing to hear someone and disagree. It's another thing to act like you don't even care that they're in the room and they're speaking to you and expressing heartfelt concerns. And for better or for worse, that's how the JeffCO group was branded, cast, perceived, and now they're out. I don't like the use of the recall tool in this fashion. I didn't like it in the General Assembly, and I don't like it in the fashion it's been used now. If you vote, you ought to just take your medicine, if this is who you put in office, and ride them out and make another choice at the next election cycle. But that's not what folks decided to do in JeffCO. Douglas County is a little bit different because I think in Douglas County, I think the board members there were respectful, inclusive. I kept reading about all these community forums and community meetings they were having. I think the people just didn't agree with where they ended up, but something else happened. I think parents and kids and communities are becoming less and less patient with school districts. They want to see more rapid results, which goes to my third point. That's why I think Happy had such a hotly contested and close election against a guy no one ever heard of before, really, and she's the incumbent president of the Denver Public School Board. That tells you that even in a community that's considered more liberal and accepting, people are becoming less and less patient with K-12 policy. And finally, I think Amy's right when she talks about reform. The train has left the station, but I would submit that reform comprehensively is different than we're thinking about it now. I think in the minds of a lot of parents, K-12 education in America is a complete do-over. We need to blow it up and start all over, and it's not charters, it's not vouchers, it's a whole systemic change, you know, getting away from September to June, school calendar year, and all of these things. And I think we're going to see more and more of this percolate to the top.
Kira, obviously recalls, which before, I think a few years ago, had only been used very sparingly when you find an elected official committing huge, heinous crimes. Now is a political weapon. Because it's been used successfully twice, as that train left the station, are we going to see more recalls being used in other areas?
Well, I think so, yes. And, you know, actually what happened in Jefferson County is very reminiscent to me of what happened as far back as 2006 in El Paso County in Colorado Springs when recall through 3 of the 4 school board members who were pro-voucher, you know, out into the street. And, you know, they too were also, those board members were incredibly disruptive. They were incredibly rude and attacked parents, attacked teachers, attacked other board members who didn't agree with them. And as a result, they were, you know, recalled. And at the time, it was, you know, a pretty high profile, you know, situation in Colorado Springs. Hadn't really hit the rest of the state. But that trend, I think, certainly continued over and replayed itself in Jefferson County. I think that the use of recall certainly will continue, particularly when you've got such big money coming in from out of state, the PAC money, the 501c4 money, very difficult to track. And when you've got that kind of money, putting sometimes stealth candidates or slate candidates into office, what then, you know, comes to the board meetings and shows up, you know, may be a big surprise for a lot of voters who may not have seen it coming. And so then, you know, once that's realized, going back and removing those troublesome candidates or troublesome board members, elected officials, who may not believe in the basic concept of public education, probably will be a tool that's used again.
Yeah. Voters in Denver were in a generous mood on Election Day, approving most of the proposed tax increases except for the proposal that would have created a college fund for low and middle income students. Amy, the city and county of Denver can usually be counted upon as a very generous bunch when it comes to tax issues. There's hard to find episodes where they have said no, although we found one of them this time. But when it came to taxing cowboys or buying some airport land, not a problem this time. Any surprises for you?
Well, actually, I was thrilled that they said no to one thing. Congratulations, Denver. Even the Democrats in Denver couldn't buy off on. And if I remember, I think even the Democrat Party opposed it. I mean, listen, you know you haven't done your homework when Denver, which is a fairly generous city, as you described, will say no. And I also think at some point too, you go to the, you sort of go to the well one time too many, and people also look and go, you know what? At some point, is this really the function of Denver city government? I mean, is this really what they're supposed to be doing? I mean, we've got a number of other issues we should be addressing. Yes, the city is generous, but even they have a point. This, city residents, city voters are at a point where I think not only did they think it was a bad idea, but I also think they had trouble swallowing this as a legitimate function of the city of Denver. So I commend them for doing that. Meanwhile, my own city passed 2 tax increases. Well, one and then extended another one. So congratulations, Denver. You said no more times than Greeley did.
Oh, there's a headline I didn't expect to hear. Penn, I guess watching the campaigns, you could clearly see the priorities from City Hall because you saw these, whether they were well scripted or not, we can argue that another day. But you saw the ads with the bulls and the whole thing and the whole stock show and everything else. I remember seeing a whole lot of ads with colleges and kids getting higher education. So was that the reason behind the result from Tuesday night?
Yes, but before I answer the question further, Amy's right. One other thing I ought to point out, we ought to acknowledge, you have 2 conservative Republicans, Tom Norton and John Suthers, both mayors of their communities, with tax increases on the ballot that they put forward. So it sort of speaks to the next topic we'll get to. But yeah, I think it mattered. We saw more cute commercials with Longhorn, Larimer the Longhorn, and talking about the DIA deal than the school deal. But I also think Amy's right. I think part of what we saw in these school board elections and part of what I think happened in Denver, and again, I think it's reflected in Happy's race, is people are saying, schools, let's figure out how to educate kids and get them out of high school with a solid foundation, and college education and how we finance that is the next step. We don't know if the city ought to do that or if the school system ought to do it. We know it's an issue, but we don't think this is necessarily the right vehicle right now to do it. But clearly voters decided, if we're going to save the National Western, and I've gotten a lot of criticism for my having commented before about the financial state of the National Western, but the whole reason for this proposal and the reason it passed sort of provides a mechanism to sustain it and transform it into something that is more economically viable into the future. And I think that's a good thing because we're preserving the Western heritage in the state. The DIA deal, I think the more remarkable part of the vote wasn't Denver, but the fact that Adams County overwhelmingly supported modifying the intergovernmental agreement with Denver to allow that development to take place out around the airport also. So interesting election results this past Tuesday.
Kara, did Denver surprise you in any way with the results from Tuesday?
Not really. I think that certainly Mayor Hancock emerged victorious, and his legacy with the National Western is, I think, assured unless things go drastically wrong down the road with the actual construction of the project, and depending on how much of the money and effort really does end up going into helping out the folks in Globeville and Elyria, Swansea neighborhoods, which also were assured great improvements in much needed areas of the city. I think that the college scholarship, Amy's absolutely right. I think voters really started scratching their heads and saying, hey, is this really a function of the city government? And I was at a meeting earlier this week with Mary Beth Sussman, the city councilwoman from Denver, and some folks in East Denver talking about the ongoing maddening frustrations over inadequate stormwater drainage and the fact that every time there's a substantial rainfall, it floods their basements, their properties, and creates thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands worth of damage. And the relief for them is years, maybe a decade or so away. And I think that really is what Mary Beth Sussman and other members of the City Council who oppose the college scholarship program are really emphasizing is the need to refocus and realize what the city is responsible for doing.
Patty, wrap it up for us.
Well, that college vote did do one thing, which is after Bloomberg came in with 150,000 infusion, and we got the worst commercial of the campaign, the Hancock Hickenlooper playing basketball. I think that alone killed the vote. Horrible commercial. And it did have the added advantage of it made the stock show commercials, which I made fun of here before, and I stand by that, look a little bit better because that one was so bad. The stock, as I've said before, I love the stock show, hate that campaign, love what this proposal could do for that part of long neglected Denver, what it can do for the Platte, what it can do for those neighborhoods. But because we just voted in a never-ending tax, what we have also voted in is a never-ending job for this town's few investigative reporters to watch where the money is going. This is a huge, huge, very vague project, and we are all going to have to pay very close attention.
We've never had a building project in Denver cost more than it did in an election.
You know where the money
that's
go
never
in funny
happened.
places?
Let's get a quick take on this last one. Governor John Hickenlooper proposed the 2017 budget with $373 million in spending cuts that may affect hospitals and higher ed. The plan also leaves room for $189 million in taxpayer refunds and was criticized by both Democrats and Republicans. Penn, your quick take.
Illustrates the issue with Tabor. The fact that we have this artificial constraint caused by Tabor. We have revenues that are in place, not because of new taxes or higher rates, just economic activity. And we're in the anomalous situation where we're going to give refunds, but we have to cut the budget because we don't have enough money to fund core governmental services. Something has to give.
Kira, this kicks off a 6-month campaign. It's going to be ugly, right?
That's right. It's going to be 6 months worth of fireworks, and what Representative Millie Hamner, described as, death by 1,000 cuts is kicking into what is going to be a high-stakes gear for higher education, $20 million in proposed cuts, and of course, rural health. I mean, it's going to be an interesting 6 months.
Patty, at least the governor was able to unify both Democrats and Republicans on this one.
Right. Well, it's going to be an interesting year because while the legislature is fighting this out, Colorado voters are going to have to deal with the issue that we have kicked the can down the road for 20 years, making the kinds of constitutional fixes we have to make to, there are a lot of provisions of Tabor people like, but there also are others in the Gallagher in 23 that have just completely hamstrung the budget. So you can't put the money where you want it. You're just stuck. And Build a Better Colorado, even if you think it's a commie plot, like I think the Independence Institute does, they're going to be traveling around Colorado and at least trying to educate people about the problems economically in our Constitution. That's good. We should all try to figure out what's going on.
Amy, your quick take on the plot.
I just want to start by saying that both Penn and Kara have said I'm right. In this show, both of them.
Do you want to end it there? So that's it. Good night, everybody.
I just want, that should be the headline. And as far as coming, no, it's politicians who continually want to spend more of taxpayer money. I mean, the refund, $189 million out of if I read this, was it a $27 billion budget? I mean, give me a break. You mean taxpayers can't have a minuscule amount of their money back? What lawmakers and the Takings Coalition don't like is that politicians will have to prioritize a budget. And dare I say, we warned a long time ago that with this dramatic Medicaid expansion, other pet projects were not going to be able to be funded. And real quickly, Linda Gorman's thumbnail guide to Colorado spending problem, higher education in 1999-2000 to today is up 614.8%. Meanwhile, transportation funding is down 9%. So it seems to me some legislators have some work to do prioritizing the budget.
If only we knew a few that would have to do some of those priorities. It should be fun. A little bit of time left. Favorite part of the show, Disgrace of the Week. Patty, start us off.
Well, the story is still unraveling in Colorado Springs, where there was that horrific shooting. Yes, we understand that you can carry in Colorado Springs, but if someone calls 911 and is a little worried about someone walking on the street with a gun, maybe the police should show up a little faster.
Amy, your Disgrace of the Week.
President Obama for canceling Keystone XL.
Penn.
The mess at Canyon City High, the high school in Canyon City, with the sexting scandal. That's spooky. That even parents who are trying to monitor their kids can't keep up with the technology.
Various apps hiding things, hundreds of kids. It looks crazy. Kara.
I have to double down on Patty's Colorado Springs and calling out the cops for not responding and going even further and defending their non-response to the 9/11 call that came in from a distraught woman reporting her neighbor was walking around not looking too good with gas cans and, long guns, maybe a shotgun, ready to shoot, and did.
Time to say something nice about somebody. Patty?
It is the start of Denver Arts Week, which has a lot of great activities around town, and especially tomorrow night at the museums. Many institutions will be open all night. It's a great time to get out and see your city.
Very nice. Amy?
Peter Groff for writing an excellent article in the Colorado Statesman about rewarding teachers for being the professionals that they are, and praising the previous Douglas County School Board for instituting market-based pay for them.
Penn?
Governor Hickenlooper on a policy call that isn't getting a lot of attention, but is raising the question of when can Colorado's Attorney General institute or join a lawsuit? When does the attorney need a client to represent? It's going to be fascinating to see how it turns out.
Kara?
Adeline Gray, who is from Colorado and is a darling, wonderful, four-time world champion wrestler who was named as a finalist for the USOC Female Athlete of the Year. Way to go, Adeline.
Cool. That is all the time we have tonight. Thanks for tuning in. Tune in Tuesday at 7 p.m. for Street Level. Host Eden Lane takes us to South Pearl Street here in Denver. Remember that you can catch any part of the show or CIO postgame online, and be sure to check out CIO Podcast on iTunes. For everyone here at Channel 12, I'm Dominic Dezzutti. Thanks very much for watching. Good night. My name is Dominic Dezzutti. I'm executive producer and host of Colorado Inside Out. I am here prepping for the show. It's Friday just before 11:30. I'm here with our producer, Gabrielle Bryant. And the two of us, before every show, what we'll do is we'll get together and go over the script. Make sure that what we wrote the day before is still applicable, if any issues have changed. More importantly, we read through the script to make sure that what we wrote yesterday is actually going to sound decent today. That's usually easier said than done.
My job on the show is to check with Dominic occasionally throughout the week, and we send topics back and forth to each other as far as checking the news headlines and seeing which stories would fit best with the show. I've worked on the show for some months now, and so I'm getting the hang of some of the ideas that the panel likes to talk about and some of the things that they don't necessarily like to focus on. So my job is to check with him on the topics. He approves them for me, and then I try my hand at writing some of the topics and making them clear for viewers. I also feel like it's my role to approach the topics in a way that people who aren't necessarily so focused on politics will still be able to understand what we're talking about. So I try to write it in a way that people like me could understand it.
Gabrielle's the perfect sounding board that if I'm going way into too much detail. And so the normal viewer, she's a very educated viewer, and so are our viewers, but she's making sure that it makes sense and not just to political junkies like myself. So she's understanding that role. That's critical to what she does in the show. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Something that a lot of you may not know is that any trivia question in the world he can answer. And if he doesn't have the answer, which he always does, he can find it for you in under 5 seconds.
Just a nice way of explaining all the different stuff in my office between Yoda dolls and Harry Potter posters. I'm a person of the people. What we're going to do right now is read through the script to make sure it makes sense and sounds good, because it's one thing to write a topic, but it's another thing to make sure it sounds intelligent coming out of your host's mouth, which can sometimes be a challenge for this particular host. We do our very best to make sure that the script doesn't set a bias one way or the other. It doesn't put any sort of judgmental words. Now, no script is going to be perfect, but that's what our panelists for. They're supposed to bring the opinion. Our topics are supposed to simply set up the idea and then let our panel get to it. So we try to get as basic as possible.
I'm just making copies for of the scripts for each of the guests, each of the panelists, and I also make a copy for Dominic. I do it on this blue paper because it's not so distracting for viewers when they're watching it.
With the trusty makeup, tea, I think we're in good shape. Let's go.